Staff Sergeant Danny Hernandez topped off the fuel bladder on his M978 HEMTT and climbed back into the cab at 3:15 in the afternoon, 26th of February, 1991. He was running diesel to the Abrams tanks of Eagle Troop, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, somewhere east of phase line Tangerine in the Iraqi desert. He was not a tanker. He was not infantry. He was a fueler, a glorified gas station on wheels trailing the tip of the spear across a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon, tan and flat and utterly without feature. His war, so far, had been hose connections and manifold pressures and the low diesel stink that never left his uniform. The radio changed that at 16:07 local. He heard it in fragments. Contact, 12 o'clock. Multiple T-72s. Dug in. A voice he recognized as belonging to Captain McMaster's crew, clipped and professional, calling fire commands. Then the 120mm guns started, and Hernandez didn't need the radio anymore because he could feel the concussions rolling through the hardpan beneath his tires, deep physical thumps that vibrated the steering column. He could see nothing. The shamal had cut visibility to under a mile, and Eagle Troop was somewhere ahead in that brown wall of haze, fighting a battle he could only hear. If you served in armor, or fueled it, or fixed it, or loaded it, drop your MOS, your unit, your years in the comments. Or write it for someone who can't, your father, your grandfather, the guy from your platoon who never talks about it. Hit subscribe and like this so it reaches them. The net crackled with overlapping transmissions, grid coordinates, rounds expended, and then a call that made Hernandez grip the dash with both hands. A crew reporting they'd taken a direct hit from a T-72 at 400 meters. He waited for the rest, for the screaming, for the call for medevac. Instead, the same crew came back on the net, irritated more than shaken, and reported the round had bounced off. They were returning fire. Hernandez stared at his radio as if it had lied to him. It had not. A 125mm 3BM-22 armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot round, a 7-kilogram tungsten penetrator traveling at 1,785 meters per second, carries roughly 11.2 megajoules of kinetic energy at the muzzle. That is enough force to throw a pickup truck 30 feet straight up. At 400 meters, it struck the turret face of an M1 A1 Abrams. It did not penetrate, not damaged, but survivable, not cracked, but held, did not penetrate. The crew's intercom recording captured a 3-second pause, then the gunner's voice, "I think they just shot us." They had. Hours later, the shamal thinned and the logistics convoy rolled forward. Hernandez saw it then. 28 Iraqi tanks destroyed. Dozens of BMPs still burning, their aluminum hulls throwing acrid white smoke. He passed an Abrams with a bright silver gouge on the left turret cheek, a scar the size of a dinner plate, and the steel beneath it wasn't even exposed. Whatever was under that outer layer had swallowed the round hole. He took a photograph with a disposable Kodak. Then he saw the T-72s and stopped understanding anything. Turrets blown completely off their hulls, some lying 15 meters away, hatches peeled open like sardine cans from ammunition cook-offs that had killed everyone inside in fractions of a second. The same weapon class, tank versus tank, and the results weren't just different. They were from different centuries. No American tanks were lost that day, not one. Hernandez looked back at the gouged Abrams, then at the field of Soviet-made wreckage stretching to the horizon, and thought the only honest thing a man in his position could think. What the hell is our armor made of? We're not going to answer that yet. What was our armor made of? To answer that, you have to go back 18 years before Danny Hernandez's convoy rolled through the wreckage at 73 Easting. You have to go to a different desert, a different war, and a catastrophe so total that it rewrote the physics of tank design. October 6th, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day on the Jewish calendar. Egypt and Syria attacked simultaneously across the Suez Canal in the south, across the Purple Line on the Golan Heights in the north. Israel had some of the best Western-designed tanks in the world. Centurions, Pattons, shot cows with upgraded armor packages. On paper, They were superior to anything the Arab coalition fielded. Paper burned fast that weekend. Soviet-supplied AT-3 Sagar missiles and RPG-7s began killing Israeli tanks at a rate no Western military had modeled. The Sagar was a wire-guided anti-tank missile that a conscript could learn to operate in an afternoon. It cost roughly $3,000. The tanks it was destroying cost $500,000. Egyptian infantry teams dug in along the canal berms, fired them in coordinated volleys, 3-4 missiles converging on a single tank from different angles. The shaped charge warhead did not need to be large. It did not need to be sophisticated. It needed only to form a superplastic jet of copper moving at 8 kilometers per second, and that jet would punch through any thickness of homogeneous steel that a tank could carry and still move. In the first 48 hours on the Golan Heights alone, Israel lost roughly 250 tanks. Crews were burning alive inside machines that were supposed to protect them. NATO watched this happen in real time, and NATO did arithmetic. The Warsaw Pact fielded approximately 42,000 tanks in Central Europe. NATO had 13,000. The entire Western defense strategy rested on a single assumption: that qualitative superiority, better training, better optics, better fire control, would offset a 3-to-1 numerical disadvantage. But the Yom Kippur War had just demonstrated that a $3,000 shaped charge could negate a $1 million tank. If that held true, qualitative superiority was a fantasy. Every war game the Pentagon ran between 1974 and 1976 ended the same way. Soviet armor reaches the Rhine in 72 hours. Western Europe falls in 2 weeks. The problem was not firepower. NATO tanks could kill Soviet tanks. The problem was survivability. NATO tanks could not survive long enough to shoot back in sufficient numbers. They needed armor that could defeat the shaped charge warhead, not incrementally, not marginally, but categorically. They needed a material that broke the physics. It already existed, and it was behind a locked door in Surrey, England. The Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment sat on a quiet campus in Chobham, Surrey, where a team led by Dr. Gilbert Harvey had been running an experiment since the mid-1960s that almost no one in the defense establishment was paying attention to. Harvey's premise sounded obvious once you heard it. Homogeneous steel failed against shaped charges because steel responds to stress in one way. It deforms plastically, and the copper jet exploits that single failure mode. What if the armor wasn't one material? What if it was a system? Harvey built sandwiches, ceramic tiles, extraordinarily hard, brittle, backed by steel plates, with elastic layers between them. Later, those elastic layers would be Kevlar. Each material responded to stress differently. The ceramic shattered the incoming penetrator tip, disrupting the jet's coherence. The steel absorbed residual kinetic energy. The elastic layers caught fragments and redistributed force laterally. No single layer stopped the round. No single layer could. But the composite system, ceramic, steel, elastic, ceramic, steel, elastic, repeated in a precise sequence at precise thicknesses, did something that homogeneous steel never could. It made the shaped charge's physics work against itself. The British called it Burlington armor. Everyone else called it Chobham. In the early 1970s, under intelligence sharing agreements older than most of the engineers working the program, Britain shared the Chobham technology with the United States. The UK would use it on the Challenger one. But America had something Britain did not: the industrial base, the budget, and the institutional willingness to iterate at speed. The XM1 program, which would become the M1 Abrams, was selected in 1976 with Chobham-derived composite armor as its core survivability feature. And then, the doors closed. The exact composition was classified above top-secret special compartmented information. The armor array was manufactured in isolated cells. No single worker saw the complete package. Components arrived in sealed containers from different facilities. Assembly teams handled their layer and nothing else. The men and women building it could not describe it. The engineers who designed it would not. An army that cannot keep a secret cannot keep an advantage. The United States intended to keep this one. The doors closed, and the arguments started. Before the first production, M1 rolled off the Chrysler defense line in Lima, Ohio, in 1980, the tank was already under siege, not by Soviet shells, but by American senators, journalists, and the Pentagon's own auditors. The weapon they used was not classified. It was a fuel gauge. The AGT-1500 gas turbine engine was a marvel of power density, 1,500 horsepower in a package lighter than any diesel equivalent. It could push 63 tons from 0 to 45 miles per hour in under 7 seconds. It could also drink 8 gallons of JP8 per mile cross-country. 8 gallons per mile. The M6 it replaced burned less than 3. A single platoon of 4 M1s required a dedicated fuel truck just to stay operational past the first day of movement. Logistics officers who ran the numbers came back looking ill. In the Fulda Gap scenario, the centerpiece of NATO's war plan, a division of M1s would consume fuel faster than the supply chain could deliver it. Congressional hearings in 1981 and 1982 were brutal. A parade of retired generals testified that the M6A3, upgraded with thermal sights and a new fire control computer, was sufficient. The M1 cost $2.8 million per unit in 1980 dollars. The M6A3 cost $750,000. For the price of one M1, you could field nearly 4 M6A3s and still have change left for ammunition. A GAO report used the phrase "logistics nightmare" on the second page, and the press ran with it for months. The gun made it worse. The M1 carried the same 105mm M68 rifled cannon as the M60, a weapon designed in the late 1950s. The Soviets already fielded the 125mm 2A46 smoothbore on the T-72, a gun with 20% more muzzle energy. Critics asked the obvious question: how is a tank with the same gun 3 times the fuel consumption and 4 times the price an improvement? The Army's answer was the armor. But the armor was classified above top secret. The generals who knew what was inside the turret cheeks could not say it in open session. The engineers who had tested it against every Soviet round in the inventory could not publish the results. The tank the Army knew was revolutionary looked to Congress and to every defense journalist in Washington like an overpriced turbine-powered fuel hog carrying yesterday's gun. Here is where irony becomes structural. 8,000 kilometers east in the GRU's Foreign Armies West Directorate, Soviet military intelligence analysts were reading the same congressional testimony, the same GAO reports, the same newspaper editorials. They were professionals. They did what professionals do. They synthesized the open source reporting into a net assessment. And their conclusion, reportedly circulated in 1982, was that the M1 Abrams was not a significant improvement over the M6A3 in combat-relevant parameters. Fuel consumption, catastrophic. Gun, identical to the previous generation. Cost, indicative of contractor corruption, not technological advancement. The assessment was thorough, well-sourced, and logical. It was also the most consequential intelligence failure in the history of armored warfare. The GRU was measuring what it could see. Fuel burn rates are not classified. Gun caliber is not classified. Unit cost is not classified. The one parameter that mattered, the one capability that would make every other metric irrelevant on the day the shooting started, was the one thing the Americans had locked behind compartmented security so tight that their own Congress couldn't access it. The Soviets didn't know what they didn't know. They benchmarked the M1 against the M60 and saw a lateral move. They were wrong by a factor that would fill a field with burning T-72s 9 years later. So, they built accordingly. In 1985, the T-72B entered production with an improved composite armor array and Contact 1 explosive reactive armor. Bolt-on boxes of plastic explosive sandwiched between steel plates that detonated outward against incoming shaped charges. Against RPGs and older anti-tank missiles, Contact 1 worked. Against kinetic penetrators, the long-rod tungsten darts that the Americans were already firing. It did essentially nothing. The Soviets believed they had achieved parity because they were measuring protection against the M60's ammunition and the last generation's missiles. They were solving yesterday's problem. And while they solved it, the Americans were doing something to the Abrams that would make the gap not just wide but obscene. They were adding depleted uranium. What happens when you weave uranium into ceramic? Something unprecedented. In 1988, the Lima Army tank plant began producing the M1A1 heavy armor, and the workers assembling it noticed only that certain sealed modules were heavier than before, significantly heavier. The modules contained depleted uranium mesh, a byproduct of nuclear fuel enrichment, integrated directly into the existing Chobham composite array. Du is 68% denser than lead. A 1-inch plate of it weighs what a 1.7-inch steel plate weighs, but density is not the point. The point is what happens when a penetrator strikes it. Depleted uranium is pyrophoric and self-sharpening. Where steel and ceramic deform and yield, Du fractures into fragments that bite back into the incoming rod, eroding it, destabilizing it, eating it alive inside the armor matrix. The M1A1's turret front now offered an estimated 600 to 700 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent against kinetic rounds. Against shaped charges, 1,100 to 1,300 millimeters. The T-72's finest kinetic round, the 3BM-32 Vant, penetrated approximately 450 millimeters at 2,000 meters. Do not move past that. Sit with it. The best round the Soviets could fire at the M1A1's face fell short by 40%. It didn't matter what range, it didn't matter what conditions. Within the laws of physics available to 1988 Soviet metallurgy, the M1A1 was invulnerable from the front. The asymmetry went beyond a technological gap. It approached something closer to a natural law. The same year, the U.S. fielded the M829A1, the Silver Bullet, a depleted uranium penetrator, 4.9 kilograms, 780 millimeters long, 27 millimeters in diameter, fired from the Abrams 120 millimeter M256 smoothbore at 1,575 meters per second. It penetrated 570 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent at 2,000 meters. The T-72B's frontal protection, even bolted with Contact 1 explosive and reactive armor, offered roughly 500 to 520 millimeters against kinetic rounds. The M1A1 could kill the T-72B at any range where it could hit. The T-72B could not penetrate the M1A1 at any range at all. This was not superiority. This was a category difference. Predator and prey wearing the same name. The weight told the story plainly. The M1A1 63 tons. The T-72B, 44.5. That 18.5-ton difference, the weight of 9 Honda Civics, was almost entirely armor. The Soviets had chosen a lighter tank for strategic mobility, for crossing bridges, for fitting on rail cars. The Americans had chosen to spend every available pound keeping crews alive. Each philosophy contained an implicit bet about what mattered most when the shooting started. By 1989, Soviet intelligence had begun to understand. Espionage helped. So did analysis of the British Challenger 1's performance data. But the real confirmation came from the slow, sick mathematics of comparing their own penetration figures against estimated American protection levels and watching the numbers refuse to work. They accelerated Contact 5, the first explosive reactive armor effective against kinetic penetrators, and rushed improved composites for the T-80U. But timelines are not wishes. Contact 5 entered limited service on the T-80U, yet the passive composite beneath it remained a generation behind. True comparable passive armor would not arrive until the T-90's Object 188 hull in the late 1990s. They were 15 to 20 years behind. They knew it. And the clock they were racing against was not technical. It was political. Because in August 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait with an army equipped almost entirely with the machines the Soviets had just realized were obsolete. Desert Storm would settle the bet: 23 minutes, 9 tanks, 28 kills. Eagle Troop crested the ridge at 73 Easting into a prepared defense. Dug-in T-72s of the Tawakalna Division, hull down, at ranges where their 125mm guns should have been lethal. Captain H.R. McMaster's lead tank took fire almost immediately. Rounds struck the turret face. The crew felt the impacts, sharp, percussive, like a sledgehammer on a cathedral bell. McMaster never ordered a halt. His gunner kept firing. Every T-72 in the engagement area was burning within 23 minutes. Not one M1A1 was penetrated. The DU-enhanced Chobham did exactly what the men who built it could never publicly say it would do. It turned incoming tank rounds into noise. Scale that across the 100-hour ground war. 1,848 M1A1s deployed. 9 lost to enemy action, mines mostly, and friendly fire. 0 penetrated frontally by enemy tank rounds. Not one. Against them, more than 1,000 Iraqi T-72s and T-55s destroyed by Abrams fire. The kill ratio for frontal tank-on-tank engagements was not 10-1. It was not 50-1. It was division by 0, a ratio that mathematicians call undefined and soldiers call surviving. At Medina Ridge, the 2nd Armored Division destroyed 186 Iraqi armored vehicles in 40 minutes. 4 Americans wounded, none killed. The engagement that passed into legend happened in blowing sand. M1A1s of the 1st Armored Division acquired T-72s at over 3,000 meters, nearly 2 miles, through thermal sights that saw heat, not light, and therefore saw through the storm as if it were not there. The M829A1 rounds covered the distance in roughly 2 seconds. They arrived carrying 520 millimeters of penetration capability and punched through T-72 turrets that offered 380. The Iraqi crews could not effectively range their targets at that distance. Their TPD-K1 laser rangefinders and 1970s fire control computers were designed for engagements at half that range. Many T-72s were destroyed before their crews knew they were in contact. They died inside machines that were blind to what was killing them. Danny Hernandez took a photograph. The M1A1 he'd been staring at had a gouge in its turret cheek, 4 inches wide, less than 2 inches deep. The turret at that point was approximately 24 inches thick. He did the arithmetic later, after someone explained the energy involved. The Iraqi round had delivered roughly 11 megajoules, enough to launch a pickup truck 3 stories into the air. It penetrated 8% of the armor's depth. Then it stopped. The photograph circulated through defense publications for years. It required no caption, 8%. That was what a 20-year technological lead looked like, measured in steel and ceramic and uranium, measured in the distance between a scar and a coffin. The photograph is a 4x6-inch Kodak print, slightly overexposed, with a date stamp in orange, February 26, 1991, burned into the lower right corner. It shows the left turret cheek of an M1A1 Abrams, registration number barely legible under a film of dust. The gouge is centered in the frame. Around it, the armor is smooth, unbothered. The flat tan of CARC paint barely chipped. Hernandez kept it in a manila envelope in his garage in El Paso for 19 years before he understood what he'd photographed. The deeper photograph, the one no camera could take, was of 2 systems of government building 2 machines of war, each according to its nature, and only one of them capable of seeing itself clearly enough to survive the result. The Soviet Union ran a closed system optimized for information control. Secrecy was the organizing principle of weapons development, of intelligence analysis, of the relationship between the state and the men who served it. This should have been an advantage. A system that controls information should be better at stealing it and better at protecting its own. But control optimizes for one thing above all others, telling superiors what they expect to hear. GRU, analysts in the foreign armies. West Directorate read, American newspapers, American congressional testimony, American think tank reports, all of which said the M1 was an expensive failure. They reported this assessment upward. Their superiors approved it. Soviet tank designers received the assessment and built accordingly. The T-72B was adequate against the M60. No one had professional incentive to report that it was irrelevant against the M1A1 because no one above them wanted to hear that the army they'd spent 40 years building was obsolete. A closed system didn't produce a wrong answer by accident. It produced a confident wrong answer by design. The American system was the inverse, and the irony is architectural. The congressional hearings that savaged the M1's fuel consumption were the same hearings that approved its production budget, every single year. The free press that called it a boondoggle created so much noise about turbine engines and logistics tales that the one secret worth keeping, the composition of the armor, stayed invisible inside the shouting. The openness the Soviets exploited for intelligence was the openness that made the M1's classified core impervious to analysis. The public debate was so loud about the wrong things that the right thing never surfaced. American democracy did not win despite airing its flaws. It won because the airing was so thorough, so relentless, so genuinely agonizing to the men who believed in the tank that the secret underneath became the one quiet thing in a deafening room. The men who built it never talked. Dr. Gilbert Harvey, who led the British team at Chobham in the late 1960s, retired without a single public interview about the armor's composition. He died in 2004. The obituary mentioned his work at the Defense Evaluation and Research Agency. It did not mention ceramics. The American engineers at what became the Army Research Laboratory in Aberdeen, the ones who integrated depleted uranium into the composite matrix, published nothing. Their names do not appear in the open literature. They attended no conferences. Some of them are still alive, still bound by classification oaths signed in the 1980s, still unable to explain precisely why a 7-kilogram tungsten dart traveling at 1,785 meters per second stopped 2 inches into their work. Captain H.R. McMaster, who led Eagle Troop over that ridge, became a 3-star general and served as National Security Advisor. He wrote a book about Vietnam called Dereliction of Duty. He did not write one about 73 Easting. The crews of the Tawakalna Division's T-72s, the Republican Guard tankers who held their positions and fired at the oncoming Abrams until they burned, were professional soldiers who did not choose their equipment, did not choose their war, and did not survive their government's failure to understand what was coming. They fought with what they had. What they had was not enough. That was not their fault. Staff Sergeant Danny Hernandez retired in 1997. He runs a small diesel repair shop on Dyer Street in El Paso. The photograph is still in the envelope. He never framed it.